The glass door slammed so hard, the security desk rattled, and the man bleeding onto the marble floor screamed that the call had already been made, and nobody answered. Margaret Hale did not move at first. She felt the sound before she saw him, a wet gasp tearing through the quiet lobby of Harborline Plaza, a medical finance complex overlooking the Cuyahoga River. Midnight had just slipped past the kind of hour when the building forgot it was important. The overhead lights hummed. The flag by the entrance hung limp. The city outside breathed slow and cold. The man staggered 2 steps, then dropped to one knee. Blood smeared his palm. His other hand clawed at the air, like he was trying to grab something that wasn't there. "They said they'd call back," he rasped. "They said wait." Margaret rose from her chair, 48 years old. Gray starting to thread through her brown hair, pulled back tight, practical. She moved without rushing shoes, whispering against the floor. Her eyes locked onto the man's face, not the wound. Shock lived there. Panic. That familiar wild look she had seen too many times in this building where money and health crossed and people broke quietly. "Sit," she said. Her voice was low, flat, not unkind. "Sit down now." He tried to argue, failed. His body folded into the chair like it had been waiting for permission. Margaret pressed a cloth to his hand firm, watching his breathing slow by inches. She glanced at the phone console. The red light blinked. Missed calls. More than one. "Who did you call?" she asked. "The compliance line. Emergency escalation. I was told it's monitored all hours." His laugh cracked. "That's what they tell investors." Margaret didn't answer. She already knew. That line routed through 3 departments after midnight, all automated unless someone with override credentials forced it open. She reached under the desk and pulled out a different handset, older corded, the plastic yellowed with age. She dialed from memory. Across the lobby, the security guard on duty, Eddie Barnes, watched her with narrowed eyes. Eddie was early 60s, former transit police, a man who believed in rules because rules had once believed in him. He started toward her. "Maggie, protocol says I know what protocol says." She cut in, not looking at him. "Protocol says he bleeds until morning." Eddie stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked at the man's shaking hands, then at the phone in Margaret's grip. He said nothing. The line clicked. Someone answered. Margaret spoke 3 words, quiet and precise. The tone on the other end changed instantly. She listened. Once, twice. Then she hung up. "Ambulance is 4 minutes out," she said to the man. "You're not dying tonight." His shoulders sagged. Relief came in a sob he tried to hide. "Thank you," he whispered. "I didn't think anyone was actually here." Margaret returned to her chair. The desk lamp cast a hard circle of light over her hands. They were steady, always had been. Eddie watched her like he was seeing something he had missed for years. "You're not supposed to have that number," he said quietly. Margaret met his gaze. "You're not supposed to let people bleed on your floor." The sirens arrived. Paramedics moved fast, efficient, already asking questions. The man was gone within minutes, the marble cleaned, the silence restored. Eddie leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. "You know they're going to ask," he said. "About the call, about how you got through." Margaret nodded. "They always ask." When Eddie left to file his report, Margaret was alone again. The river outside reflected the city lights like broken glass. She opened the ledger she kept beneath the desk. Not company issued. Personal. Names, times, notes written small and neat. Things that didn't fit into systems designed by people who went home at 5. Her phone rang. Not the emergency line, not the main desk. A direct internal extension that hadn't lit up in months. Margaret stared at it. The number meant nothing to most people. To her, it meant a door that only opened when something was very wrong. She answered. Harborline reception. Silence. Then breathing. Controlled but tight. A man measuring each breath like it cost him something. Don't route this call, the voice said. Calm on the surface. Strain underneath. And don't say my name. Margaret straightened. Her eyes flicked to the security cameras, then back to the empty lobby. You're calling from the West Tower, she said. That floor is closed. I know, the man replied. That's the problem. She waited. She had learned long ago that silence made people tell the truth faster than questions. The man exhaled. There's a transaction clearing in less than 30 minutes, he said. Healthcare bonds tied to patient access funds. If it goes through the way it's set now, 2 hospitals in this county lose coverage by morning. No warning, no appeal. It's legal. Barely. Margaret's pen stopped moving. She did not look surprised. She felt something colder settle in her chest. And you need something from me, she said. I need to know who's still in this building, he replied. Who actually answers when it's late. Footsteps echoed behind her. Linda Cross appeared from the corridor, heels-sharp coat still on. Early 50s, immaculate. The kind of woman who slept with her phone on the nightstand and never missed a headline. She froze when she saw Margaret on the call. Margaret did not turn around. Put the call on hold, Linda said softly, already smiling. That extension routes to executive operations. Margaret covered the receiver with her hand. Go home, Linda. Linda's smile tightened. That's not your decision. Margaret looked at her then. Really looked. It is tonight. On the line, the man spoke again. Is someone else there? Yes, Margaret said. Someone who doesn't want this call to exist. Then we don't have much time, he replied. Because they already decided I wouldn't stop this. Linda stepped closer. You're crossing a line, she hissed. You don't even know who that is. Margaret felt the weight of the ledger beneath her fingers. Names she never shared. Numbers no one asked for. I know exactly who it isn't, she said. It isn't someone who needs permission to do the right thing. On the other end of the line, the man went quiet. Then softer. You sound like you've done this before. Margaret closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Images flashed. Meetings that ended without minutes. Calls that never made it into logs. People told to wait until morning while systems decided their worth. I don't do this for the first time, she said. I do it because nobody else stays. Linda laughed sharp and brittle. You think you're some kind of gatekeeper? She said. You answer phones. Margaret opened her eyes. The pen in her hand snapped. Tonight, Margaret said, voice steady as stone, I answer consequences. On the line, the man inhaled. When he spoke again, there was something else there. Interest, recognition. Then tell me, he said, who actually controls the overnight clearances. Margaret began to speak. Outside, the river kept moving indifferent. In less than 30 minutes, something much larger than a receptionist, larger than a building, was going to learn that the quietest person in the room had never been powerless. The first clearance warning hit the system at 12:26 in the morning, a soft digital chime that meant nothing to most people and everything to Margaret Hale. She did not look at the screen right away. She listened instead. The building had a sound when it was about to turn on its own occupants. The elevators clicked awake one by one. Somewhere above, a ventilation unit shifted into a higher cycle. Money moved through buildings the way pressure moved through pipes, and right now, the pressure was rising. On the phone, the man from the West Tower went quiet. Not the silence of disconnection, the silence of calculation. Someone just flagged the batch, he said finally. That means legal has eyes on it. Margaret's fingers slid across the console, pulling up a status view she was never trained to use and had memorized anyway. They always flag it, she said. That's not the decision point. Behind her, Linda Cross folded her arms. Her voice was calm now, careful the tone she used in boardrooms. Margaret, this stops now. You're interfering with a regulated process. Margaret did not turn. So was the compliance line that didn't answer, she said. So was the investor who bled on our floor. Linda exhaled through her nose. You don't understand what you're touching. Margaret's eyes flicked to the ledger, then back to the screen. I understand who it touches. On the line, the man spoke again. You said you know who controls overnight clearances. I do, Margaret replied. Not by title, by habit. By who people assume won't push back at this hour. She typed a short sequence. The system paused, then asked a question it had not asked anyone in years. She answered without hesitation. Linda stepped forward. That access is not yours. Margaret finally turned her head. Her gaze was steady, unblinking. Neither is the fallout. Linda's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down, then up again, eyes sharper now. You just tripped an internal audit, she said. Do you have any idea how that reads at this hour? Margaret did not respond. She watched the progress bar stall, then resume at a slower pace. Delay, not a stop. A window. On the other end of the call, the man let out a breath that sounded like relief, wrapped in disbelief. You bought us 6 minutes, he said. That shouldn't be possible. Margaret's voice stayed even. It is when people forget that someone has to be awake to approve the machine. Footsteps echoed again. Eddie Barnes reappeared near the security desk report, still in his hand. He took in the scene in a glance. Linda. Margaret. The tension stretched tight between them. Everything all right, he asked, already knowing the answer. Linda turned to him. She's accessing restricted systems. Eddie looked at Margaret. Are you? Margaret met his eyes. I'm preventing harm. Eddie's jaw worked. He had spent a lifetime standing between rules and consequences. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Maggie, he said, using her name like a warning and a plea. If this goes bad, they won't protect you. Margaret nodded once. They never do. On the line, the man cleared his throat. I need to know something, he said. Are you doing this because you think you're right, or because you don't care what happens to you after? Margaret did not answer immediately. Her mind flashed to her father asleep in a narrow bed, to hospital bills folded too neatly, to years of night shifts where she learned which lights flickered before failing. I care, she said finally. That's why I can't look away. Another chime, louder this time. The system escalated. Linda's phone buzzed again, longer. She answered it, turning her back slightly, her posture shifting into performance. Yes, she said. I'm here. Yes, I see it. No, I don't know why that trigger was pulled. Margaret listened without listening. She was already moving to the next step, one she had never tested, one Frank Miller had warned her about with a half-smile years ago. He had called it the courtesy delay, a relic from when systems assumed a human conscience somewhere in the loop. She hesitated for half a second. Then she activated it. Across the lobby, a monitor flashed amber. Linda spun back around. What did you just do? Margaret's voice was quiet. I asked the system to wait for a signature that doesn't exist anymore. Linda stared at the screen. That's not possible. It is, Margaret said. It's just inconvenient. On the line, the man went very still. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The strain was still there, but something else had joined it. Respect. You just froze a $4.2 billion clearance, he said. No one has done that since the 90s. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. She felt the weight of the moment settle fully now. Then, we have until morning, she said. And after that, it won't be my problem anymore. Linda laughed, a sharp sound that echoed too loud in the empty lobby. You think this ends with you walking away? She said. People lose careers over less. Margaret opened her eyes. People lose lives over more. Sirens wailed faintly outside, unrelated and constant. Cleveland never really slept. It just shifted. Eddie stepped closer to Margaret's side. He did not touch her, but he stood there solid. If they ask, he said quietly. "I'll tell them the system glitched." Margaret glanced at him surprised. Eddie shrugged slightly. "I'm tired of pretending I didn't see things." Linda looked at both of them, then back at the screen. Her composure cracked just enough to show fear. Not of punishment, of irrelevance. On the line, the man spoke again, slower now. "You still don't know who I am." Margaret's lips curved just barely. "I know you're someone who waited too long to call the right number." There was a pause. Then, "That's fair," he said. "For what it's worth, I'm not used to being told no." Margaret's fingers rested on the ledger. "Neither is the system." Silence stretched. Heavy. Charged. Outside, the river kept moving. Inside, a building designed to move money was being forced to wait by a woman whose job was supposed to be answering phones. At 12:41 in the morning, the amber light held steady. And for the first time in a very long time, the quietest desk in the building sat at the center of a decision that would not stay hidden for long. By 1:15 in the morning, the silence had weight. It pressed against the glass walls of Harborline Plaza, against the closed elevators, against the amber warning light that still glowed on the monitor like a held breath. Margaret Hale sat upright at the desk, hands folded, eyes forward. She had stopped touching the keyboard. The system was waiting now, and so was everyone else. Linda Cross paced, back and forth. Her heels no longer clicked with confidence, but scraped faintly, the sound uneven. She checked her phone again, then again, as if staring hard enough might force a different outcome. "This is unsustainable," she said, not to Margaret, not to Eddie, but to the room itself. "Someone senior is going to wake up. Someone always does." Margaret did not respond. She had learned that fear fed on answers. On the line, the man from the West Tower had gone quiet again. Not calculation this time. Listening. The kind of listening that came when a person realized they were no longer in control of the clock. At 1:22, the first elevator opened. 2 men stepped out. Suits loosened ties, the look of people dragged out of bed by alarms that did not lie. Behind them came a woman with a tablet held tight against her chest, hair pulled back hastily, glasses still fogged from the cold outside. Legal? Compliance? The building had decided to wake up. Linda straightened instantly, smoothing her coat, stepping forward before anyone spoke. "Thank God," she said. "There's been an unauthorized access. I was just about to escalate." The taller man, early 50s, eyes sharp, despite the hour, glanced at the monitor, then at Margaret. "Who initiated the courtesy delay?" Linda opened her mouth. Margaret spoke first. "I did." The word landed clean. No apology. No explanation yet. The woman with the tablet looked startled. "That function hasn't been used in decades." Margaret nodded. "That's why it still works." The shorter man scoffed. "You're a receptionist." Margaret met his gaze. "Tonight, I'm the person who answered." The man from legal inhaled sharply, already forming arguments. Eddie shifted his weight, a quiet presence, at Margaret's side. Linda's eyes flicked to him, then back to Margaret, disbelief flashing across her face. "This is absurd," Linda said. "She doesn't understand the scope of what she's done." Margaret turned slightly, just enough to face Linda. "You didn't understand the scope of what would happen if it went through." The man from the West Tower spoke into the line. His voice carried now, amplified by the speaker Linda had turned on earlier without thinking. "She understands it better than you think." All eyes went to the phone. "And you are the legal officer," began. "Someone who built the first version of that clearance system," the man replied. "And someone who remembers why the courtesy delay existed in the first place." Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Margaret felt it shift then, the moment when titles stopped working the way they usually did. The woman with the tablet glanced down at her screen, scrolling fast. "The delay requires an executive signature that was retired," she said slowly, "which means the batch cannot clear without manual intervention." By morning, Margaret added, when there are people awake to answer for it. The shorter man frowned. This delay is costing lives, Margaret said quietly. Or it would have. Linda turned on her voice sharp. You don't get to decide that. Margaret looked at her. Really looked. The faint tremor in Linda's hand. The way her confidence had always relied on being the loudest voice in the room. I didn't decide, Margaret said. I noticed. The man from the line exhaled slowly. There are hospitals in this county that would have lost coverage by sunrise, he said. No warning, no appeal window, perfectly legal, completely devastating. The compliance officer swallowed. Why wasn't this flagged earlier? Linda answered quickly. Because the review process. Because the review process assumes no one will look at it this late. Margaret interrupted. It assumes the building is empty. The taller man studied her now, curiosity edging out irritation. How did you know? Margaret hesitated, not because she lacked the answer, because answers had consequences. She glanced at the ledger, then closed it gently. Because I've been here long enough to see which calls never get returned, she said, and which ones stop ringing when they should get louder. The woman with the tablet nodded slowly. The compliance line log shows multiple unanswered escalations tonight. Linda stiffened. That's not relevant. It is, now, the woman replied. The man from legal rubbed his forehead. This delay will trigger a review. Margaret nodded. It should. Linda laughed again, too loud, too brittle. And when that review shows an unauthorized receptionist froze a multi-billion-dollar transaction, the man on the line cut in. Then it will also show that the system allowed it. Another pause. Longer this time. And that he continued was by design. Margaret felt the air change. Not relief. Not victory. Something heavier. Something like inevitability. Who are you? The taller man asked again, more carefully now. There was a beat. Then the man said it. Calm. Unadorned. My name is Daniel Wright. The name landed hard. Recognition flickered across faces. Linda's smile vanished completely. The founder, the compliance officer whispered. The same Daniel replied. And before anyone asks, no, I did not authorize this delay. I needed to see who would. All eyes turned back to Margaret. She did not flinch. You could have stopped it, she said into the phone. You didn't. No, Daniel agreed. I didn't. Linda stepped forward, panic breaking through at last. This is a setup. She manipulated the system. Margaret's voice stayed level. I followed it. Daniel spoke again, quieter now. Linda, how many times has the overnight compliance line failed in the past year? Linda froze. I don't have that number. I do, Daniel said, because I started asking when my calls stopped being returned. The ledger sat heavy beneath Margaret's hands. She had not opened it. She did not need to. The taller man cleared his throat. This meeting will be documented. Daniel's voice sharpened. Good, because I want it documented that the only person in this building who acted with urgency tonight was the one without a title. Linda looked at Margaret, then something breaking in her eyes. Not anger, fear of being seen clearly for the first time. This isn't over, she said, voice low. Margaret met her gaze. It never is. At 1:40 in the morning, the courtesy delay held. Outside, the river kept moving. Inside, the system waited exposed, unable to hide behind silence anymore. Margaret leaned back in her chair, exhaustion finally brushing the edges of her control. Eddie placed a paper cup of water on the desk beside her without a word. She took it, nodding once. On the line, Daniel spoke softly now. No audience in his voice. You didn't know who I was. Margaret took a sip. I still don't need to. Daniel smiled on the other end, though no one could see it. "You might soon," he said, "because by morning, this building is going to remember your name." Margaret set the cup down. Her hands were steady. They always had been. Morning did not arrive gently. It came in fragments. A ringing phone that did not stop. Voices echoing down the corridor. The low mechanical growl of elevators running too often too early. By 6:10 in the morning, Harbor Line Plaza was awake, in a way it had not been in years, alert and uneasy, like a patient who had survived the night but was not yet out of danger. Margaret Hale was still at the desk. Her coat hung on the back of the chair. The desk lamp remained on its yellow circle, now swallowed by daylight pushing through the glass walls. Her eyes burned, but her posture did not sag. She had learned long ago that fatigue showed first in the shoulders, and she refused to give it that victory. Linda Cross returned just after 7. She had changed clothes. Dark blazer, hair perfect, the performance uniform. She walked fast, eyes forward, pretending the night had not cracked anything open. 2 men followed her senior operations faces, set in practiced neutrality. Linda stopped short when she saw Margaret still there. "You're supposed to be off shift," she said sharply. Margaret did not look up. "I stayed." "That wasn't a suggestion," Linda snapped. Margaret lifted her gaze slowly. "Neither was what happened last night." One of the men cleared his throat. "Ms. Hale, we need to ask you a few questions." Margaret nodded. "I expected that." Linda turned to him. "This shouldn't take long. She doesn't have standing." The man ignored her. He pulled out a small recorder and set it on the desk. "Start from when the call came in." Margaret began. She did not dramatize. She did not defend. She spoke in measured sentences, describing the timing, the tone of the voice on the line, the delay the systems she accessed. She did not mention fear. She did not mention instinct. She mentioned facts. Linda shifted with every sentence. Halfway through, the man raised a hand. "You were aware this could cost the company significant exposure." "Yes," Margaret said. "And you proceeded anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" Margaret paused. "Not for effect. For honesty." "Because I have watched people suffer while waiting for morning," she said. "And last night I was awake." The recorder hummed softly. The man nodded once, then turned it off. "That will be all for now." Linda's mouth opened. "You can't be serious." The man met her eyes. "We're done here." Linda stared at Margaret like she was seeing her through glass for the first time. "You think this makes you important?" she said quietly. "It doesn't. You're still replaceable." Margaret's voice was steady. So is silence. Linda walked away without another word. By 8:30, the building filled with people who had never noticed the night desk before. Executives passed through the lobby pretending not to look. Assistants whispered. Phones rang with questions no one wanted to answer yet. The amber warning light was gone, replaced by a calm blue status that felt almost mocking. Eddie Barnes finished his shift and lingered leaning against the wall near the desk. "You should go home," he said gently. "Get some rest." Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." He studied her face. "You know they're going to try to bury this?" "I know," she said. "And you're still here." Margaret glanced at the ledger, then closed it for the last time. "I've been buried before," she said. "This isn't new ground." At 9:45, the West Tower elevators opened again. Daniel Wright stepped out. He did not look like a man who had slept. His suit was pressed, but his eyes carried the weight of the night sharp and restless. People noticed him immediately. Conversation stalled. Linda reappeared at once, her smile back in place like armor. "Daniel," she said brightly, "we weren't expecting you so early." Daniel did not return the smile. His gaze moved past her straight to the desk. Margaret rose slowly. Not out of deference, out of respect for the moment. They looked at each other across the polished floor. The noise of the lobby faded into something distant and unimportant. You stayed, Daniel said. Yes. You didn't have to. I know. He nodded once. That's why I came down. Linda stepped between them, her voice smooth. Daniel, if you'd like to discuss what happened, we should do it upstairs. This isn't the place. Daniel did not look at her. This is exactly the place. He turned back to Margaret. How long have you worked here? 18 years. And in those 18 years, he asked how many times has the overnight compliance line failed? Margaret did not hesitate. More times than anyone has written down. Linda's jaw tightened. That's speculation. Daniel finally looked at her. His gaze was calm, cold. Then you won't mind an audit. The word landed with a thud. Linda's composure cracked just slightly. Of course not. Good, Daniel said. Because it starts today. He turned back to Margaret. You didn't know who I was when you answered. No, you didn't ask. No. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That may be the most honest thing that's happened in this building in years. Margaret felt the weight of eyes on her now. Curiosity. Judgment. Something like hope from places she hadn't expected. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He placed it on the desk, not sliding it toward her yet. This isn't a reward, he said quietly. It's an invitation. Temporary. Voluntary. Margaret did not touch it. To what? To sit in on the review process, he replied. As an observer. Because I want someone in the room who remembers what happens when systems stop answering. Linda laughed sharply. You're bringing her into executive review. She's a receptionist. Daniel's voice did not rise. It did not need to. She's a witness. The lobby fell silent. Margaret looked at the paper. She thought of her father's hospital room, of the ledger now closed, of the night she had not walked away. I won't protect anyone, she said. Not you, not them. Daniel nodded. I'm counting on that. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Margaret looked up. You didn't just delay a transaction, he said. You exposed a habit. He met her eyes again. And habits don't change quietly. Daniel walked toward the elevators. Linda stood frozen, staring after him, the mask finally gone. Eddie exhaled slowly beside the desk. Looks like you're not invisible anymore, he murmured. Margaret watched the doors close. The building buzzed around her louder than it had ever been. No, she said softly. Now they have to see me. And for the first time since she took the night desk all those years ago, Margaret Hale did not feel like she was waiting for morning to matter. By noon, the building felt hostile in a way Margaret had never known, as if the walls themselves had decided she was a problem that needed solving. People stopped greeting her. Conversations paused when she walked past. Doors closed more carefully. The night desk, once invisible, had become a fault line. Margaret noticed everything the way she always had. She noticed the security cameras angling a degree lower, the way Linda Cross's assistant avoided eye contact, the way an unfamiliar man lingered near the elevators, pretending to scroll on his phone while listening to everything. Margaret did not flinch. She had learned that flinching invited pressure. Daniel Wright had gone upstairs with legal and compliance. The invitation he left on the desk remained untouched. Not because she feared it, but because she understood timing. Power was rarely about taking what was offered. It was about choosing when. At 12:40 in the afternoon, the call came from a number that did not appear on any directory. Margaret answered. Harborline Reception. This line is recorded, a man said. His voice was precise, practiced. State your full name, Margaret Hale. I'm calling from an external regulatory office, he continued. We have questions regarding an overnight interference with a federally linked healthcare transaction. Margaret glanced at the lobby. Linda stood across the room speaking in low tones to two men in suits she did not recognize. She was watching. I'm available, Margaret said. The man paused. We weren't expecting that response. Margaret's mouth curved slightly. Most people aren't. The questions came measured and cold. Times, access points, intent. Margaret answered each one clearly, carefully, without embellishment. She did not volunteer motives. She did not speculate. She described what happened, not why she believed it should have happened. Are you aware, the man asked, that your actions may have delayed critical financial movement? Yes. And you proceeded? Yes. Why? Margaret did not rush this time. Because financial movement is not neutral, she said. It moves through people. There was a silence on the line. Not calculation. Something closer to surprise. We'll be in touch, the man said. So will I, Margaret replied, and ended the call. Across the lobby, Linda's conversation stopped. Her eyes narrowed. She walked toward the desk with controlled steps. You're enjoying this, Linda said softly. Margaret met her gaze. I'm enduring it. Linda leaned in, lowering her voice. You think Daniel Wright will protect you? He won't. Men like him don't burn systems. They adjust them. Margaret's voice stayed level. Then he'll have to adjust around me. Linda straightened. You don't belong in this. Margaret folded her hands. Neither do broken systems. Linda laughed under her breath and walked away, heels sharp again, louder than necessary. Margaret watched her go, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way certainty had begun to erode. At 1:30, Daniel returned to the lobby. He did not approach the desk immediately. He stood near the glass wall overlooking the river, speaking quietly into his phone, one hand pressed to his temple. Margaret watched the city reflected in the glass behind him, distorted and restless. When he finally approached, he did not smile. They're moving faster than I expected, he said. Margaret nodded. They always do when light hits them. Daniel rested his hands on the desk. External regulators called you. Yes. They called me too, he said. They're looking for a scapegoat. Someone small enough to absorb blame without consequence. Margaret met his eyes. That's not new. Daniel studied her for a long moment. You didn't take the invitation. No. Why? Margaret's gaze did not waver. Because I don't sit in rooms where the outcome is decided before the first sentence. Daniel exhaled slowly. Fair. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Then hear this. There are people on my board who think the courtesy delay was a flaw that needs eliminating. Margaret's jaw tightened. Because it made them uncomfortable. Because it made them accountable, Daniel corrected. And they don't like that. So what happens now? Margaret asked. Daniel straightened. Now the system pushes back. As if summoned by the words, a man stepped out of the elevator behind Daniel. Late 50s, immaculate suit. The kind of confidence that came from never having to raise his voice. He approached the desk without hesitation. Daniel, he said smoothly, we need to talk. Daniel did not turn. You can wait. The man's eyes flicked to Margaret. Appraisal. Dismissal. This is about her, he said, which is why it can't. Margaret spoke before Daniel could respond. If it's about me, she said you should use my name. The man blinked. Excuse me? Margaret Hale, she continued. And if you're here to suggest that last night didn't happen, you're late. The man smiled thinly. You're out of your depth. Margaret returned the smile. I've been here 18 years. Daniel turned, then facing the man fully. This is Henry Caldwell, he said to Margaret. Board member. Former Treasury liaison. Margaret nodded once. That explains the call. Henry's smile faded. You've caused a disruption. Margaret's voice was calm. I revealed one. Henry leaned in slightly. Disruptions have consequences. So do omissions, Margaret replied. The air between them hardened. Daniel stepped forward. Henry, this conversation isn't happening at the front desk. Henry's gaze did not leave Margaret. It is if she insists on being here. Margaret felt the moment settle. The old instinct whispered to step back, to shrink, to let the men resolve it. She ignored it. I insist, she said. Henry's lips pressed into a line. Very well. Then hear this. The courtesy delay will be removed. The system will be corrected. And you will return to answering phones. Margaret leaned back, slightly, eyes steady. You can remove the delay, she said. You can't remove the record. Henry's eyes flicked to Daniel. You told her. No, Daniel replied. She noticed. Henry straightened. This is bigger than you. Margaret nodded. That's why I stayed. For a long moment, no one spoke. The lobby hummed around them, indifferent and watchful. Then Henry turned away sharply. We'll be in touch, he said to Daniel, and walked toward the elevators without another word. Daniel watched him go, jaw tight. You made an enemy. Margaret exhaled slowly. I already had them. Daniel looked at her, then something unreadable in his expression. You understand what this will cost? Yes. And you're still here. Margaret nodded. I didn't answer last night to be comfortable. Daniel glanced at the closed invitation on the desk. Then you should come upstairs now. Margaret did not move. Not yet. Daniel studied her, then nodded. When you're ready. He turned to leave, then paused. They're going to try to isolate you, he said quietly, push you back into the dark. Margaret watched the river beyond the glass, steady and unbothered. Then they'll have to follow me there. Daniel walked away. By 3 o'clock, the lobby had thinned again. The tension remained, stretched and humming, but quieter now. Eddie Barnes returned with 2 cups of coffee and set one down without asking. You okay? He said. Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup. It was warm. Solid. No, she said. But I'm still here. Eddie smiled faintly. That's usually enough. Margaret took a slow sip, eyes forward. Somewhere above her systems were being rewritten. Arguments, sharpened decisions, delayed. Somewhere beyond the glass, the city kept moving. And at the center of it all, the night receptionist who had never been supposed to matter sat exactly where she needed to be, waiting, not for permission, but for the moment when the system finally admitted it could not proceed without her. The isolation began quietly, the way real pressure always did. Margaret felt it before anyone said a word. Her access badge still worked, but doors took a fraction longer to unlock. Emails arrived without her name on them, replies looping around her like she was a missing rung. Even the air felt different, thinner, as if the building had learned how to hold its breath. At 4:30 in the afternoon, her desk phone rang and went silent before she could answer. The pattern repeated, rings cut short. Someone testing how long it would take before she stopped reaching for it. She did not stop. When the call finally stayed on the line, the voice was unfamiliar and clipped. This is facilities. We need you to vacate the night desk starting tonight. Margaret kept her tone neutral. On whose authorization? A pause. Temporary reassignment. To where? Another pause, longer this time. Break room operations. Margaret almost smiled. Almost. Put it in writing. The line went dead. Eddie Barnes appeared from the security corridor, keys in hand, concern written deep into the lines of his face. They're moving you, he said quietly. I just heard. Margaret nodded. I expected that. They can't do that, Eddie said. Not without cause. They'll find one, she replied. They always do. At 5:10, Linda Cross emerged from the elevator with Henry Caldwell at her side. Their steps were measured synchronized, a practiced choreography of authority. They stopped short of the desk. Linda spoke first. "Margaret, effective immediately. Your role is being reassigned." Margaret met her gaze. "You tried that already." Henry's voice was smooth. "This isn't a discussion." Margaret's eyes flicked to the camera above the desk. "Then you won't mind documenting it." Henry's jaw tightened. "You're overestimating your position." Margaret folded her hands. "You're underestimating your exposure." Linda laughed softly, the sound rehearsed. "You really think a receptionist can threaten a board?" Margaret leaned forward slightly. "I think a board should be careful about who it silences after a night like that." Henry's eyes narrowed. "You're playing a dangerous game." Margaret's voice stayed level. "I didn't start it." Daniel Wright stepped out of the elevator behind them. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush. His presence alone shifted the gravity of the lobby. Henry turned startled, then masked it quickly. Daniel Henry said, "We were just resolving an internal matter." Daniel looked past him to Margaret. "Are you—" Margaret did not look away. "They're attempting to remove me from the desk." Daniel turned back to Henry. "On what grounds?" Henry adjusted his cuffs. "Operational efficiency." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then, let's be efficient." He gestured toward the seating area. "All of us. Now." The conversation that followed was low and intense, words, clipped pauses, heavy. Margaret listened more than she spoke, watching the way Henry deflected the way Linda avoided specifics. Daniel asked precise questions and waited for complete answers. When they didn't come, he let the silence do the work. At 6:15, the meeting ended without resolution. That Margaret knew was a resolution. Henry left first, face tight. Linda followed her composure, cracking only once when she glanced back at the desk she had ruled for years. Daniel lingered. "They're pushing hard," he said. "They always do when they're afraid," Margaret replied. He studied her. "They're preparing to make you the problem." Margaret nodded. "That's easier than fixing the system." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I can protect you." Margaret met his eyes. "No. You can stand with me." The distinction hung between them. At 7:45, the first official notice arrived. Human Resources, subject line careful and bloodless. Temporary reassignment pending review. Margaret read it once, then set it aside. The lobby thinned as evening approached. Day staff left. Night staff prepared to arrive. Margaret remained at the desk, coat still on the chair, ledger still closed beneath her hands. At 8:30, the compliance line rang. This time it did not stop. Margaret answered. "Harbor Line Reception." A woman's voice broke through, tight with fear. "They told me to wait until morning. They always tell me that." Margaret closed her eyes for half a second. "What's happening?" "My husband," the woman said. "His coverage just changed. They're saying the procedure isn't authorized anymore." Margaret's pulse quickened. She glanced at the status board. A new batch. Different pathway. Same pattern. "I need you to breathe," Margaret said gently. "I'm here." Behind her, Eddie stiffened. He had heard that tone before. Margaret listened. Asked questions. Took notes. She recognized the structure immediately. A workaround. Legal. Cruel. She transferred the call to the handset dialed from memory. The line answered faster this time. "Daniel Wright," the voice said. "They're trying again," Margaret said. A pause. "I know," Daniel replied. "They thought you'd be gone by now." Margaret looked at the empty lobby, the desk that was no longer supposed to be hers. "I'm still here." "So am I," Daniel said. "Tell me what you see." Margaret described it, slowly, precisely. She felt the system's shape in her mind, the way it bent around rules without breaking them. She saw the pressure points. She spoke them out loud. On the other end, Daniel was silent for a long moment. This time he said finally, "They're testing you." Margaret's grip tightened on the receiver. Then they should have studied harder. She activated the courtesy delay again. The amber light returned. Eddie exhaled sharply. "They're going to lose it." Margaret nodded. "They already have." Within minutes, messages flooded in. Alerts, warnings, requests. Linda's name flashed on the caller ID and vanished. Henry's followed. Margaret did not answer. At 9:10, Daniel came down again. Not alone this time. 2 board members with him, faces grim, eyes sharp. They stopped short when they saw the amber light. One of them spoke. "Who authorized this?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "I did." The woman stared at her. Again. "Yes." "On what authority?" Margaret lifted the handset still connected. "On the authority of answering the call." Daniel stepped forward. "And on mine." The board member turned to him. "You're making this worse." Daniel shook his head. "I'm making it visible." Silence fell. Margaret felt the weight of the moment press down on her heavy and clarifying. She thought of the man who had bled on the floor, of the woman on the line now still breathing because someone had stayed, of the years she had learned to watch and wait. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," Margaret said quietly. "I'm here to stop the damage." The board members exchanged looks. Calculations shifted. Finally, the woman nodded once. "We'll review the batch manually." The amber light blinked, then changed. Relief did not come all at once. It seeped in slowly like warmth returning to cold fingers. Daniel met Margaret's eyes. "They can't ignore you anymore." Margaret set the receiver down gently. "They'll try." Daniel smiled faintly. "Then we'll make it harder." As the lobby settled again, Eddie leaned closer. "You know," he said softly, "they're going to remember this night." Margaret looked at the desk, the phone, the quiet space she had guarded for years. "So will I." Outside, the city lights flickered on steady and stubborn. And in the center of it all, a woman who had been told to step aside answered another call, her voice calm, her presence undeniable, holding the line while a system learned that it could no longer move without being seen. The retaliation did not come as anger. It came as paperwork. By 10:20 the next morning, Margaret Hale's name appeared in 3 separate internal notices, each written in language so careful it felt sharp. Policy review. Role clarification. Temporary suspension of discretionary access. None of it accused her directly. All of it pointed in one direction. Erase the anomaly. Restore the pattern. Margaret read each message once, then folded them neatly and placed them beneath the ledger she no longer opened. The desk phone rang as usual. She answered as usual. Her voice did not change. People noticed that more than anything else. The first person to speak to her directly was not Linda Cross. It was a junior analyst named Rebecca Sloan, early 30s, shoulders hunched like she expected to be struck. She hovered near the desk, pretending to check her phone, until Margaret looked up. "Ms. Hale." Rebecca said quietly, "Can I ask you something?" Margaret nodded. "Why didn't you stop?" Rebecca asked. "When they told you to." Margaret studied her for a moment. She saw the exhaustion behind the question, the nights spent fixing numbers that hurt people Rebecca would never meet. "Because stopping doesn't end the damage," Margaret said. "It just hides it." Rebecca swallowed. "They're saying you acted alone." Margaret's lips pressed together. "That's convenient." Rebecca hesitated, then leaned in closer. "They're also saying the compliance logs were altered before last night. Months before." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "By whom?" Rebecca shook her head. That's the problem. The access trail loops. Someone high enough to disappear inside it. Margaret nodded once. Thank you for telling me. Rebecca exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. I don't know how long I can keep doing this, she whispered. Margaret met her gaze. Then don't do it alone. Rebecca straightened and walked away quickly, shoulders lighter than when she'd arrived. At 11:45, the lobby filled with suits again. This time there were no smiles. The mood had shifted from control to containment. Henry Caldwell arrived flanked by two attorneys Margaret did not recognize. Linda followed her expression, closed, careful. They did not approach the desk. They stopped 10 feet away like Margaret occupied contested ground. Henry spoke first. This is escalating. Margaret looked up from her notes. So are the consequences. One of the attorneys stepped forward. Ms. Hale, effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties pending investigation. Margaret stood, slowly, deliberately. She smoothed her jacket, then looked at each face in front of her. Who is answering the phones? Linda scoffed. That's not your concern. Margaret's voice hardened just enough to register. It is if the calls keep coming. As if summoned by the words, the desk phone rang. The sound cut through the lobby like a blade. Everyone froze. Margaret answered. A man's voice spilled through the receiver, frantic and shaking. They said there was no one available. They said to call back later. I can't wait. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. I'm here, she said. Tell me what's happening. The attorneys exchanged glances. Henry's jaw tightened. I'm at Mercy East, the man said. They're saying my wife's coverage changed overnight. She's in surgery prep. They won't proceed. Margaret's pulse stayed steady. I need you to stay with me, she said. I'm going to ask a few questions. She wrote quickly, her pen moving with quiet authority. She knew this pattern now. A different shell. Same core. Linda stepped forward. You cannot do this. Margaret did not look at her. I already am. Henry snapped, End the call. Margaret covered the receiver with her hand. If you fire me while I'm preventing harm, she said evenly, make sure you're ready to explain that. Silence followed. Thick. Public. The man on the line breathed hard. Please, he whispered. Margaret uncovered the receiver. I'm still here. She transferred the call to the handset, dialed a number that now rang familiar. Daniel Wright answered on the second ring. They're forcing a confrontation, Margaret said. Daniel's voice was low. I see it. They're trying to remove me mid-call. I'm on my way down, Daniel said. Do not hang up. Margaret nodded, though he could not see it. She continued speaking to the man, grounding him, asking him to breathe, to listen. She could feel the room watching her, the way fear and authority wrestled for control. Daniel arrived in less than 5 minutes. This time, he did not come alone. 2 additional board members followed him along with a woman Margaret recognized from regulatory filings, her presence a quiet warning. The lobby felt smaller, suddenly the air tight. Daniel took in the scene in a glance. The attorneys. Linda. Henry. Margaret on the phone. He did not raise his voice. Step back. Henry bristled. This is an internal matter. Daniel's gaze did not waver. It stopped being internal when people started bleeding and dying behind legal language. One of the board members cleared her throat. Daniel, this has gone far enough. Daniel turned to her. It hasn't gone far enough. Margaret continued the call, her voice calm, guiding the man through what she could and could not promise. She ended the call only when she had confirmation that the hospital had escalated the case. She set the receiver down gently. I want it on record, she said, turning to the group, that this is the 4th call this morning with the same structure. One of the attorneys frowned. That's hearsay. Margaret met his eyes. Then check the logs you haven't been checking. The woman from the board looked sharply at Henry. You said this was contained. Henry's composure slipped. It was. Daniel stepped forward. It was buried. Linda finally spoke. Her voice strained. You're tearing this place apart. Margaret looked at her. No, I'm showing you where it's already broken. The room fell silent again. This time the silence held something else. Recognition. Daniel turned to the board. If you remove her now, I will make this public. Every call, every delay, every name that signed off on silence. One of the board members stared at him. You would do that? Daniel nodded once. Yes. Margaret watched them calculate. She had seen this look before on people who thought risk only existed for others. Finally, the woman from the board spoke. Stand down, she said to the attorneys. Not yet. Henry's mouth opened, then closed. Linda looked at Margaret with something close to disbelief. You think you've won? Margaret shook her head. I think the calls haven't stopped. Daniel turned to Margaret. You're not suspended. Margaret nodded. I didn't ask to be. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. They're digging. Margaret met his gaze. Then they'll find more than they wanted. As the group dispersed reluctantly, the lobby exhaled. Eddie Barnes appeared at Margaret's side, his expression grave and proud all at once. They tried to cut the line, he murmured. Didn't work. Margaret allowed herself a single breath of relief. Then the phone rang again. She answered. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet war unfolding in glass and marble. Inside, a woman who had been trained to disappear stood exactly where the system wanted her gone, answering every call, holding the line, while the truth pushed its way upward, unwilling now to be silenced. The breaking point did not announce itself with noise. It arrived as clarity. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Margaret Hale was escorted upstairs. Not by security, by legal. The hallway on the 22nd floor smelled faintly of coffee and recycled air. Glass walls framed conference rooms filled with people pretending not to stare. Margaret walked steadily, hands relaxed at her sides, posture straight. She had already passed the point where nerves mattered. What remained was focus. Inside the room, the blinds were half drawn. Daniel Wright stood near the window jacket off sleeves rolled, looking out over the river. Henry Caldwell sat at the table with two attorneys. Linda Cross occupied a chair at the far end, hands folded, expression composed in the brittle way Margaret now recognized as fear, disguised as control. The door closed. Let's begin, one of the attorneys said. Margaret did not sit until Daniel did. When he took a seat, she followed, placing her notebook on the table unopened. This meeting, the attorney continued, is to determine whether Ms. Hale's actions constitute misconduct or a systemic failure. Margaret lifted her gaze. It can be both. Henry scoffed. You don't get to frame the question. Margaret's voice was calm. I didn't frame it. The calls did. Daniel leaned forward. Proceed. The attorney nodded. Ms. Hale, how many calls have you personally handled in the last 48 hours that involved delayed or denied coverage linked to overnight processing? Margaret answered without hesitation. 11. Linda's head snapped up. That's impossible. Margaret turned slightly. It's not. Those cases were reviewed, Linda said. They were compliant. Margaret's eyes stayed on the attorney. Compliance isn't the same as care. The room went quiet. Henry folded his hands. You're emotionalizing a technical process. Margaret finally looked at him. You're anonymizing harm. Daniel watched closely, now silent. The attorney cleared his throat. Ms. Hale, do you have documentation? Margaret slid the notebook forward. I do. Linda stiffened. That ledger is not company property. Margaret did not look at her. It's a record of calls that didn't make it into your system. The attorney opened the notebook. Page after page of dates times initials, short notes written in careful script. No names. Just patterns. Henry leaned forward, scanning. His expression changed. These timestamps, he said slowly, align with unlogged escalations. Daniel nodded. Which means the system didn't fail. People bypassed it. Linda's voice sharpened. You can't prove intent. Margaret spoke softly. You don't need intent to establish responsibility. The attorney looked up. Ms. Hale, why didn't you report this earlier? Margaret met his eyes. Because reporting requires someone willing to listen. Silence followed. Not empty. Heavy. Daniel stood. I want to be clear, he said. What happened over the last 2 days did not start with Margaret Hale. It ended with her refusing to look away. Henry shook his head. You're letting sentiment cloud governance. Daniel turned to him. You're confusing governance with insulation. Linda finally broke. You think she's some kind of hero? She said. Voice tight. She isn't. She broke protocol. Margaret looked at her, then really looked. So did you? She said, quietly. Every time you chose quiet over action. Linda's composure cracked. You don't know what it's like to survive in this building. Margaret's voice did not rise. I know exactly what it's like. I just chose not to become you. The words landed hard. The attorney closed the notebook slowly. This requires an external review. Henry stood abruptly. Absolutely not. Daniel stepped closer. It's already triggered. Henry froze. By whom? Daniel held his gaze. By me. The room shifted. The balance tipped. At 3:45, the meeting ended without a verdict. But verdicts did not always arrive as decisions. Sometimes they arrived as momentum. Margaret returned to the lobby. The desk looked the same. The phone sat where it always had. But the air felt different now. Less hostile. More alert. People passed and looked at her openly, no longer pretending she wasn't there. Eddie Barnes met her with 2 cups of water. How bad, he asked. Margaret took one. Bad enough that it can't go back. Eddie nodded. That's usually how it works. At 4:10, the phone rang. Margaret answered. Harbor Line reception. A woman's voice came through, shaky but determined. They said I should speak to you. They said you'd understand. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Tell me. The call lasted 20 minutes. Then another. Then another. Each one followed a familiar pattern, but something had changed. The callers weren't just desperate. They were informed. Someone had told them not to wait. Someone had told them there was a human on the line. At 5:30, Daniel returned to the lobby. He did not speak right away. He watched Margaret handle a call from beginning to end, her voice steady, grounding, precise. When she hung up, he nodded once. They're going to remove the courtesy delay, he said quietly. They'll say it's too vulnerable. Margaret considered that. Then they'll have to replace it with something better. Daniel studied her. You're not supposed to be this calm. Margaret smiled faintly. I've been calm for years. No one noticed. Daniel leaned against the desk. They're offering you a deal. Margaret's expression did not change. I'm listening. Temporary consulting role, he said. Limited scope. Silence clause. Margaret met his gaze. No. Daniel nodded. I thought you'd say that. They want me quiet again, Margaret continued. With a title this time. Daniel exhaled. What do you want? Margaret looked at the phone, at the empty space around the desk, at the people passing who were finally paying attention. I want the line staffed, she said. Always. I want escalation logs reviewed in real time. And I want protection for the people who speak up. Daniel's eyes sharpened. That will upset a lot of people. Margaret nodded. It should. At 6:15, Linda Cross walked through the lobby carrying a box. Not the dramatic kind, just cardboard, office supplies. A framed photo turned face down. She stopped at the desk. I didn't think it would end like this, Linda said, quietly. Margaret looked at her. It doesn't have to end. It just has to change. Linda swallowed. I told myself I was protecting the system. Margaret's voice softened just a fraction. Systems don't need protecting from truth. Linda nodded once. She did not apologize. She did not ask for forgiveness. She walked out. As the evening settled, the lobby grew quiet again. Not empty, just still. Margaret answered another call. Outside, the river caught the light of the setting sun, steady and unremarkable. Inside, a system built to move silently was learning slowly and painfully what it meant to be seen. And at the center of it all, a woman who had spent a lifetime being overlooked remained at her desk, voice calm, presence unmovable, holding the line as the world finally caught up to the cost of ignoring it. The aftermath arrived without ceremony, settling over Harborline Plaza like dust after a demolition. By the next morning, the lobby screens displayed new notices written in careful language. Interim review. Process adjustment. External oversight pending. The words looked clean. The reality underneath them was not. Phones rang differently now, sharper, more urgent, as if callers had learned that waiting was no longer the safest choice. Margaret Hale sat at the desk she had never left. Not because she refused to move, but because the work kept coming. She answered one call, then another, her voice steady, her questions precise. She no longer felt the weight of eyes avoiding her. She felt the weight of attention, and it was heavier. At 9:30, Daniel Wright returned with a small group that did not wear badges. No assistants, no legal escorts, just people who listened first. They stood back watching Margaret handle a call from a man whose mother's coverage had been flagged overnight. Margaret walked him through options without promising what she could not deliver, grounding him until the panic loosened its grip. When she ended the call, Daniel nodded. This, he said quietly to the group, is what accountability sounds like. The group dispersed without applause. That was how Daniel did things now. No spectacle, just change. At 10:15, the first official announcement landed in inboxes across the building. The overnight compliance line would be staffed by trained personnel. All escalations would be logged in real time. Courtesy delays would be replaced by a human review window with named responsibility. The message did not mention Margaret Hale. It did not need to. People knew. Rebecca Sloan appeared at the desk again this time, standing straighter. They asked me to help build the review process. She said, disbelief flickering behind her eyes. They said I had insight. Margaret smiled faintly. You always did. Rebecca hesitated. They're saying you pushed this. Margaret shook her head. I answered. Rebecca nodded slowly as if tasting the difference. At 11:40, an unfamiliar man approached the desk, mid-40s tired eyes, the look of someone who had driven too far without stopping. They told me to come here, he said. Said you'd know what to do. Margaret gestured to the chair. Sit. He sat. He talked. She listened. The pattern held. When he left steadier than when he arrived, Margaret felt the quiet certainty settle deeper. This was not victory. It was work. By early afternoon, the building began to resist again. Not openly. In small ways. A request delayed. A meeting rescheduled. A resource quietly redirected. Margaret noticed every instance. She noted them without comment. She did not need to confront each one. She needed to see the shape of the resistance. Daniel returned to the desk at 3:10, his expression tight. They're floating a narrative, he said. That this was a temporary overreaction. Margaret nodded. They want the story to shrink. Yes. Then it won't, she replied. Daniel studied her. They're asking me to move you upstairs. A title? A door? Margaret's gaze stayed on the lobby, on the flow of people who no longer walked past without seeing her. If I go upstairs, she said, this desk goes quiet again. Daniel exhaled slowly. I know. I'll go. Margaret continued. When there's someone here who answers the way I do. Daniel's eyes sharpened. That could take time. Margaret nodded. Then I'm patient. At 4:20, Eddie Barnes clocked in early. He leaned against the wall beside the desk, arms crossed, watching the lobby with a new kind of calm. Never thought I'd see the day, he said quietly. They used to pretend nights didn't exist. Margaret glanced at him. They exist whether you look or not. Eddie smiled. Ain't that the truth? At 5, the phone rang again. A woman on the other end spoke in a voice worn thin by too many explanations that went nowhere. Margaret listened, asked questions, took notes. When the call ended, Margaret sat still for a moment longer than usual. Daniel noticed. Bad one. Familiar one, Margaret said. He waited. They told her to appeal. Margaret continued. Appeals take time she doesn't have. Daniel's jaw tightened. We'll fix that. Margaret met his gaze. We'll change that. The distinction mattered. As evening settled, the lobby grew quieter, not empty, just less frantic. Margaret felt the shift in her bones. The work was beginning to hold. At 6:30, a courier delivered a thin envelope addressed to Margaret by name. Inside was a formal notice. Her reassignment had been rescinded. Her role remained unchanged. For now. Margaret folded the letter and placed it in the drawer she had never locked. At 7, Linda Cross's name disappeared from the directory. There was no announcement, no explanation, just absence. Margaret noticed the way people paused at the desk when they realized. Some looked relieved. Some looked afraid. One looked ashamed. Margaret did not react. She answered the phone when it rang. Daniel returned one last time that night, standing across from her as the building prepared to sleep again. They're not done, he said. Margaret nodded. Neither am I. They'll try to wait you out. She met his eyes. I've been waiting my whole career. This time, I'm not alone. Daniel smiled, then small and real. You know they'll write this as policy. Margaret's lips curved slightly. Then make sure they remember why. He nodded and stepped back, letting the moment settle. By 8:45, the last call of the evening came in. A simple question. A clear answer. Margaret handled it with the same care she gave every voice. When the lobby finally quieted, Margaret leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a single breath. Not exhaustion. Recognition. The system had not collapsed. It had resisted. And in resisting, it had shown its cracks. Outside, the river moved on steady and indifferent. Inside, a building built to move money had learned slowly that it could no longer move without accountability. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the desk, the phone, the quiet space that had become something else entirely. She did not feel powerful. She felt necessary, and for the first time, that was enough. The night returned to Harborline Plaza the way it always had, quietly without asking permission. Margaret Hale sat behind the desk as the city lights outside softened into reflections on the river. The day shift had gone home. The meetings were over. The emails had slowed. What remained was the part of the building that never made the reports, never appeared in headlines, never waited politely for daylight. The phone rang. Margaret answered on the first ring. Harborline reception. A man's voice came through low and unsteady, carrying the weight of a long day that had gone wrong in too many places. They told me to call this number, he said. They said someone would actually listen. Margaret adjusted the lamp, the familiar pool of light settling over her hands. "You're in the right place," she said. "Take your time." As he spoke, she watched the lobby through the glass. The empty chairs, the quiet elevators. This was where the system showed its true shape, not when it was loud and confident, but when it was tired and exposed. She listened the way she always had, not just to words, but to the spaces between them, to the fear people tried to hide, because fear had never been welcome in official channels. When the call ended, the man's breathing steadier than when it began, Margaret placed the receiver down gently. She did not rush. She never did. Rushing made people feel alone. Eddie Barnes appeared from the security corridor, coffee in hand, moving slower these days, but no less observant. "Quiet," he said. For now, Margaret replied. He leaned against the wall beside her, looking out at the city. "You know, he said I spent most of my career believing nights didn't matter. That real decisions happened somewhere else by people with titles." Margaret glanced at him. "And now?" Eddie smiled faintly. "Now I know better." Upstairs, the building hummed with a different kind of activity. New systems were being drafted. Old processes were being examined by people who had never bothered to look before. Names were being written down where there had once been silence. It was not justice. It was something slower. Accountability. Daniel Wright came down just before 10. No entourage, no urgency in his step. He stopped a few feet from the desk, watching Margaret handle another call before speaking. "You're still here," he said. Margaret nodded. "So are the calls." Daniel rested his hands on the counter. The board approved the changes. "Which ones?" Margaret asked. "All of them," he replied. "Staffed overnight escalation. Independent review. No silence clauses." Margaret considered that, then nodded once. "Good." Daniel studied her. "They want to formalize your role." "I know. You still haven't said yes." Margaret looked at the phone, then at the empty lobby beyond. "I said I would stay until this desk didn't depend on one person." Daniel followed her gaze. "And when it doesn't?" "Then I'll move," she said. "Not before." Daniel smiled, not the tight smile of negotiation, but something easier. "You changed the center of gravity," he said. "That doesn't happen often." Margaret's voice was quiet. "It happens when people stop pretending they didn't hear." Daniel nodded. "You never asked who I was that night." "No. You never asked what this would cost you." Margaret met his eyes. "I already knew." He straightened, preparing to leave. "They'll tell this story differently," he said. "They'll make it about systems and policies." Margaret allowed a small smile. "Stories always try to protect the powerful." Daniel paused. "And you?" Margaret looked at the phone again. "I'm not the story," she said. "I'm the voice people reach when the story fails them." Daniel accepted that without argument. He turned and walked back toward the elevators, his reflection stretching across the glass. The lobby settled into its familiar rhythm. The lights dimmed slightly. The city outside breathed. Margaret answered another call, then another. Each one different. Each one the same, in the way that mattered. Sometime after midnight, she opened the drawer and took out the old ledger. She ran her fingers along the spine, then closed it again and placed it back. It had served its purpose. The silence it documented no longer owned the room. The phone rang once more. Margaret answered, her voice calm, steady, unmistakably present. "This is Harbor Line," she said. "I'm here." Outside, the river continued its slow, patient movement, indifferent to glass towers and boardrooms and policies rewritten under pressure. Inside, a building that had once hidden its damage in the dark now had a light that stayed on. Not because someone demanded it, because someone answered. If this story reminded you that quiet people often carry the heaviest weight, tap like subscribe for more, and leave a comment below with 3 words in English that say, what you felt. Your voice matters.